how difficult the later floors of the Spiral Abyss is, it's a must that players have a well-built team as well as a good knowledge of the theory behind these teams. Welcome back to another Genshin Impact video where we'll be discussing the 3 most commonly used team setups in the Spiral Abyss. We'll also talk about the 3 main roles used in these comps as well as give examples as to which characters fit these roles. We'll be discussing the theory behind team building as well. So without further ado, let's get started. Starting off with the main roles used in these teams. There are 3 primary roles you should take note of when team building. These 3 are the main DPS, the sub DPS, and the support. Main DPSs are the characters that take the most time on field. They have high damage scalings and multipliers which help them deal massive amounts of damage. They are most of the time supported by the team's sub DPSs and supports. Moving on to the sub DPS, they are the characters that take little time on field while providing great amounts of off-field damage and utility. They can even be enabler DPSs who have fast elemental application, enabling consistent proccing of reactions like Vaporize or Melt. Supports are characters that deal minimal amounts of damage while being able to buff the whole team's damage or provide debuffs to the enemy units. They also provide reliable utility such as shield protection, damage reduction, and healing.
Now that you know about these 3 roles, let's move on to the most used team setups in the Abyss. These are Hypercarry, Quickswaps, and Dual Carry setups. Starting off with the Hypercarry setups, these setups are composed of a main DPS and a good amount of supports. Hypercarry setups are called as such because the whole team is centered around buffing and supporting a single character, helping this character carry the team as a whole. In this setup, the main DPS is usually a character who has great multipliers or scalings and does a major amount of damage during their uptimes. Characters that fit this description are Hu Tao, Ganyu, Xiao, Eula, Ayaka, Diluc, and to some extent, the Raiden Shogun. Main DPS are supported by the sub DPS in the terms of providing great amounts of off-field damage that complements with the main DPS skill. What do I mean by this? Simply consider, in a physical Eula Hypercarry comp, using Xiangling as your sub DPS will provide you less damage than if you use a more compatible sub DPS such as, for example, Beidou, Lisa, Fischl, or the Raiden Shogun. This is because a physical Eula can take advantage of Xiangling's consistent pyro application since her kit will revolve around dealing primarily physical damage, therefore prohibiting both Eula and Xiangling's potential to maximize their damage outputs. Going back, the sub DPS characters that come to mind when making a Hypercarry comp are Xingqiu, Beidou, Xiangling, Kaya, Fischl, Albedo, and Nicolo. The third slot in your team is usually filled up by either another sub DPS or a support that would further buff your main DPS and sub DPS damage. Characters that fit this role are any of the mentioned sub DPS characters, plus Sucrose, Kazuha, Lisa, Mona, Venti, Shenhe, and Yunjin. The last slot is usually filled up by a utility support that provides the team more survivability through shields or healing to keep them from dying and preferably provide more buffs that boost the whole team's overall damage. Characters that come into mind are Leona, Bennett, Jin, Thoma, and Zhongli. Moving on to Quickswap comps, Quickswap setups are setups that generally have no main DPS, but rather are composed of 4 well-invested characters that have great source of off-field damage. These characters generally have elemental skills or bursts that have high uptimes, low cooldowns, and ability to provide lots of energy particles for each other. As such, team comps that are utilizing this setup are primarily composed of sub DPS characters as they have a good source of off-field damage from their elemental skills and burst, with some even providing buffs to the team. Characters that can fit in this setup are Raiden Shogun, Xiangling, Miko, Bennett, Kazuha, Chongyun, Xingqiu, Rosaria, Kaya, Sucrose, Lisa, and Venti. These characters have high elemental skill or burst uptimes, low cooldowns on either both of these, and deal considerable to great amounts of damage. An example of a team comp utilizing this setup would be the Raiden National Comp, consisting of Raiden, Xiangling, Xingqiu, and Bennett. Raiden will be the team's universal battery, providing flat energy through her burst while providing burst damage buffs, consistent electro application through her skill and burst, and massive amounts of damage with her burst. And Xiangling will provide consistent Pyro AoE application and great amounts of off-field damage through her burst, and as well as providing energy particles through her skill. Xingqiu provides consistent off-field Hydro application, allowing Raiden to proc Electro Charge, and Xiangling to vaporize her Pyranido attacks. He also provides reliable survivability for this team through his rain swords, as these provide good damage reduction, interrupt resistance, and as well as provide some healing. Lastly, Bennett provides massive healing and attack stat buffs which further boost the team's overall damage. He also provides plenty of particles with her spammable skill, which allows him to battery both himself and Xiangling. As you can see, the characters used in the comps all complement each other's strengths and weaknesses. This is the primary reason as to why it works as a comp and why it's popular in the Abyss. Another setup that is also utilized in clearing the Abyss are dual carry setups, which involves two characters that are a DPS sub-DPS hybrid, or in other words, characters that can perform both as a main DPS and a sub-DPS very well at the same time during battles. These two characters are alternating between main DPS and sub-DPS, with one of the characters performing the main DPS role during the uptime of its main damage source, while one performs the sub-DPS role during its downtime of its main damage source. A team comp that utilizes this setup is Raiden International, wherein either Tartaglia or Ayato will be replacing Xingqiu in the Raiden National comp, as mentioned a while ago. The Kamisato sibling team comp composing of Ayato, Ayaka, Kokomi, or Mona, and a Nemo support like Jin, Sucrose, Venti, or Kazuha is also a team utilizing this setup.
In team building, we advise to always keep in mind these three things. Firstly, the setup that you want to use. Whether it's a Hypercarry, Quickswap, or a dual carry, always keep in mind the setup you will be running, as this will help you lay out the characters that you can use on your team. Secondly, determine the strengths and weaknesses of the characters you will be using, and build your team around those strengths and weaknesses. For example, Ganyu. Ganyu's strength is her high damage scalings from her charge attacks and her ability to deal massive amounts of both AoE and single target damage. As such, it's important to include in the team units that will boost her damage through buffs or reactions, such as Xiangling or Shenhe. However, her weaknesses are that she's quite squishy and vulnerable to taking massive amounts of damage from enemies, so using units that provide protection for her is a good choice to make. Characters such as Zhongli, Diona, or Noelle can provide some buffs and protection through their shields. Of course, characters that can complement both a character's strengths and weaknesses are preferred, which in Ganyu's case will be Bennett, among many others. Those were a lot to take in, right? But don't worry, as learning how to properly team build takes time and a lot of effort. This video is just a guide as to how exactly you can do that, but how exactly you'll team build still heavily depends on the Spiral Beast lineup and your playstyle. So don't worry if you see other people using team setups that you aren't too fond of, because as long as the team that you are using clears the Abyss just fine, then all's well that ends well. Keep learning the theories behind it and you'll do fine in future Abyss lineups. And that's another guide video from us, and we thank you for watching.